What's something a man did that instantly made you lose attraction? Story 1. It was early on in the relationship and we had been dating for about a month. We went out for dinner at a nice restaurant and everything was going great. We were laughing, having a good conversation, and enjoying the evening. Then, as we were finishing our meal, I noticed he was constantly checking his phone. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a few minutes, he was completely immersed in whatever was on his screen, not engaging with me at all. I asked him if everything was okay, and he casually mentioned, "Oh, just some important work stuff." I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more it started bothering. The moment when he put his phone down, he looked at me like he hadn't seen me in a while. It felt like he had checked out mentally. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't actually present in the moment, and it completely turned me off. I tried to talk to him about it later, but he dismissed it. That was the moment I realized he wasn't as considerate as I had hoped. Story 2. I was out with my boyfriend and his friends one weekend. We were all at a pub, having fun, chatting, and enjoying the vibe. The group of us were talking about our favorite hobbies, and I mentioned how much I love photography. I've been into it for years, and I'm actually quite good at it. My boyfriend immediately scoffed and said, "You're not a photographer unless you're doing it professional." I was taken aback, but I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. But as the conversation went on, he kept belittling my passion, making comments like, "It's just a hobby, you don't really have any real skills. And, anyone can take pictures." I tried to explain how much it meant to me, but the more I spoke, the more dismissive he became. His friends didn't help either, just letting him talk over. By the end of the night, I felt completely small and embarrassed. It wasn't just the comments, it was the complete lack of respect for something I love. I realized that if he couldn't respect something as simple as a hobby, he wasn't someone I could rely on for support in the future. Story 3. We'd been dating for a few months and I thought things were going well. Then, one day, he invited me to meet his family for the first time. I was excited, nervous, but ready to meet them. We had lunch, and everything seemed fine until his mom asked me a simple question. "What do you like to do for fun?" I began sharing my favorite activities like hiking, reading, and going to concerts. Suddenly, he cut me off mid-sentence and said, "She's just being dramatic. She's a boring person." Everyone at the table went silent, and I was left speechless. His mom and dad didn't seem to know how to respond, and it felt like I was being humiliated in front of them. He didn't apologize or even acknowledge that what he said was hurtful. I tried to laugh it off, but the damage was already done. After that day, I felt like he didn't value me or my interests, and it became clear that I wasn't as important as he wanted me to think. I lost all respect for him in that moment, and the attraction faded almost instantly. Story 4. I was at a friend's party with my boyfriend, and we were all talking about our favorite childhood memories. When it was his turn, he told a story about how he used to pick on his little sister when they were kids, calling her names and teasing her constantly. At first, I thought he was going to say something along the lines of, "We laugh about it now," or "It wasn't that bad," but instead, he went on to say how proud he was of making her cry. He laughed about it, and everyone else around the table awkwardly chuckled along. But for me, it was a red flag. I had a younger brother, and I couldn't imagine ever being proud of making him feel small. When I looked at him, he seemed so proud of himself, and I realized in that moment how he viewed people close to him. It wasn't just about the joke, it was about the lack of empathy and respect. The way he could hurt someone he was supposed to love and find joy in it completely killed the attraction I had for. Story 5. I had been casually seeing this guy for a few weeks, and he seemed charming enough. One day, he invited me over to his place to watch a movie. We were sitting on the couch, enjoying the film when he started talking about his ex-girlfriend. At first, it seemed harmless. Just some stories about their relationship. But then, he started throwing out all these little jabs about her, calling her crazy, saying she was too emotional, and belittling everything she did. He made it sound like the entire relationship was her fault, and that he had done nothing wrong. I kept quiet, but the more he spoke, the more I realized how bitter and resentful he still was. I found myself getting turned off by his attitude toward her, but also toward women in general. It was clear he hadn't learned anything from that relationship. The more he went on, the more I saw that he had a tendency to blame others for his problems. I felt uncomfortable and just wanted to leave. By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't be with someone who couldn't take accountability for their actions. Story 6. We had been dating for a while when we decided to take a trip together. We were both looking forward to it, especially since it was going to be a more intimate, relaxing weekend. I thought it would give us a chance to bond more deeply, but it ended up being the complete opposite. We arrived at the Airbnb and immediately started unpacking. He took over the entire space, organizing everything exactly how he wanted. I didn't mind at first, but then it became clear that he wasn't interested in compromising. He insisted on controlling every decision, even down to how I should arrange my own things. I made a joke about how he was taking charge like he was the boss, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he gave me a stern look and said, "If you want it done right, you should just let me handle it." It felt patronizing and dismissive, like he was treating me like I couldn't make my own choices. As the weekend wore on, it became clear that he had a tendency to take over everything we did. From the itinerary to how we spent our downtime, nothing felt like it was truly a joint effort. I kept feeling more and more like a guest in my own relationship. By the time we got home, I realized that I wasn't interested in someone who couldn't respect my opinions or boundaries. I tried to talk to him about how it made me feel, but he brushed it off. The lack of consideration for my thoughts and space killed any attraction I had left. Story 7. I had been seeing this guy for a few months and everything was going well. We got along, had fun together, and seemed to be on the same page. One evening, we went out to meet up with some of his friends and the night took an unexpected turn. During the conversation, he started making jokes about women, saying things like, "Girls are too emotional," and "You just can't take a joke sometimes." The whole group laughed along, but I felt the blood rush to my face. I tried to laugh it off, but my stomach sank. It wasn't just that he was saying these things in front of his friends, but the way he said it with such a smug, arrogant attitude. It wasn't just a harmless joke, it was a clear reflection of how he viewed women in general. I found myself becoming more distant from him during the rest of the evening. Every time he made another joke, I felt smaller. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to be with someone who didn't respect, or any woman for that matter. We ended up leaving early, and that night I knew I couldn't continue seeing him. No matter how attractive or funny someone is, if they don't value you as an equal, it's impossible to feel any lasting attraction. Story 8. We had been together for a few months, and while we didn't always see eye to eye on everything, I felt like we had a pretty solid relationship. One evening, we were having a casual conversation when I mentioned a difficult situation I had been dealing with at work. I told him I was feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, and I was looking for some support or advice. Instead of being understanding, he laughed and said, "You just need to suck it up. It's not that bad." I was taken aback, but I brushed it off. However, the more we talked, the more I realized he didn't actually want to listen or empathize. He continued to minimize my feelings, saying things like, "Everyone goes through stuff at work, it's not a big deal," and "You're just overreacting." I felt dismissed and invalidated. I wanted to feel heard and supported, but instead, I felt like I was being belittled for having emotions. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it was the breaking point. I realized that I couldn't be with someone who was incapable of offering emotional support. No matter how attractive or charming someone might be, when they show a lack of empathy for your feelings, that's when you lose attraction. Story 9. I've always been a very independent person, and one thing I value deeply is my ability to make decisions for myself. When I started dating this guy, things seemed great at first, but after a few weeks I began noticing a pattern. He would consistently question my choices, whether it was where I wanted to go for dinner, what movie I wanted to watch, or even how I spent my free time. At first I thought it was just him trying to be helpful or make suggestions, but it quickly turned into something else. One evening, we were planning to meet up with some friends, and I suggested we take my car since it was closer. He immediately shot me down saying, "No, my car's better. We'll take mine." It wasn't just about the car. It was about his need to control every situation. It wasn't a matter of convenience or practicality. He was dismissing my opinion just because he could. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his controlling tendencies were getting in the way of my independence. I want to be with someone who respects my autonomy, not someone who tries to dictate every little decision. I lost all interest in him the moment I realized how dismissive he was of my independence, and I couldn't imagine a future where I felt stifled. Story 10. I met this guy at a party and we instantly hit it off. He was funny, charming, and seemed like someone I could see myself with. As we started spending more time together, I noticed something that initially didn't seem like a big deal but quickly became a huge red flag. Whenever we went out in public, whether it was at a coffee shop or a busy street, he would constantly make comments about other women. He'd point out women's looks and rate them, saying things like, "She's a solid 7," or "I wouldn't mind having a night with her." It was all in a tone that felt way too comfortable, almost like he was oblivious to how inappropriate it was. At first, I just ignored it, thinking maybe he was joking or didn't realize how disrespectful it sounded. But over time, it became clear that he was completely serious. What bothered me the most wasn't just his comments. It was the way he had no respect for women. It felt like he viewed them as objects to be rated or compared. No matter how attracted I was to him initially, I couldn't ignore the fact that he had such a shallow, objectifying view of women. It didn't take long before I realized that someone who can't see the value in a person beyond their looks was not someone I wanted in my life. The attraction disappeared almost overnight, and I ended things with him soon after. Story 11. It had been several months into our relationship when I finally agreed to meet his best friend. He was so excited about introducing us, talking about how they were inseparable and how great his friend was. So, I had high expectations. We went to a local bar, where we all ordered drinks and started chatting. At first, it was fine, but then something unexpected happened. His friend made a few jokes about me, poking fun at my job. It was a little uncomfortable, but nothing I couldn't handle. However, as the night went on, the jokes kept coming. Every time I shared something about my day or mentioned something I cared about, he had a sarcastic comment or a mocking laugh. I didn't want to make a scene, but my boyfriend didn't step in once. In fact, he seemed to find it funny. He would laugh along, making me feel even more isolated. I started to feel humiliated and wondered why I was even there. It felt like my boyfriend didn't have my back, like he was too busy trying to impress his friend to care about how I was feeling. At one point, I excused myself to go to the bathroom and just sat there, questioning everything. I realized that if he wasn't going to stand up for me in front of people important to him, he wasn't the kind of partner I wanted. The rest of the night was a blur, and when we left, I couldn't wait to get home. I ended things the next day. I didn't want to be with someone who didn't respect me enough to defend me. Story 12. We had been talking for a few weeks and things were going smoothly. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. One evening, we went to a cozy little cafe to have dinner. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how he kept talking about his ex-girlfriends. Every single story, no matter how small, seemed to somehow involve them. My ex loved this dish, he said. She'd always make fun of me for how I eat. Then, my ex would have hated this cafe, but she loved that place down the street. I tried to steer the conversation away, but every time, he brought it back to his past relationships. It wasn't just the frequency, it was the tone. He spoke about his exes in such a dismissive, almost condescending way, like they were just part of his story to tell, and their feelings didn't matter. The more he talked about them, the more I felt invisible. I was sitting right there, trying to have a nice evening, and he couldn't even focus on me for more than a few minutes without drifting back into his past. At the end of the dinner, I felt drained, and the excitement I had felt about this date was completely gone. I thought maybe it was just a bad night, but when it kept happening, I realized it wasn't just the exes. It was his inability to be truly present in the moment. I lost all attraction after that, and we never saw each other again. Story 13. It was about 2 months into our relationship when we decided to go to his cousin's wedding. I was excited to meet his extended family and to get a better sense of how he interacted with them in a big group. At first, everything seemed normal. He introduced me to people and we were laughing and dancing. But then, as the night went on, I started noticing how he interacted with his cousin's bride. It wasn't overt, but the way he spoke to her was different. He kept complimenting her appearance, making little jokes, and even touching her arm a bit too much for my liking. The longer I observed, the more uncomfortable I became. At one point, he whispered something in her ear and I could see her laugh uncomfortably. It was clear she was trying to brush it off, but I noticed the way she subtly stepped back each time he came near. What bothered me wasn't just his behavior. It was that he didn't even seem to notice how uncomfortable she was. He was too busy trying to make himself the center of attention, even at someone else's wedding. I thought about confronting him right there, but I didn't want to cause a scene in front of his family. We left shortly after, and as we drove home, I asked him about his interactions with her. He laughed it off, saying, "I was just being friendly." That response didn't sit well with me. If he couldn't respect boundaries with his cousin's wife, I could only imagine how he would treat me in the future. I didn't have the emotional energy to deal with someone so clueless, so I ended things soon after. Story 14. I was in the early stages of dating this guy, and we decided to spend a day together at the park. The weather was perfect, and we had planned to do a little hiking, grab some food, and just enjoy each other's company. But as the day unfolded, I noticed a pattern in his behavior that quickly became a huge turnoff. We were hiking, and at the top of the trail we sat down to take in the view. He started talking about his childhood, and as he did, he casually mentioned how he used to lie about the smallest things, and how people believed him because he was so good at it. He laughed as he told me how he used to get away with stealing candy, or how he would convince his teachers that he hadn't been cheating when he had. He seemed to think it was all fun and games, a harmless part of his past. But to me, it wasn't. The more he talked about how easy it was for him to manipulate people, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't just about the past. It was the fact that he was bragging about it like it was a talent. I didn't want to be with someone who thought dishonesty was something to be proud of. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but he kept circling back to the same topic. By the time we finished our hike, I felt uneasy. I couldn't ignore the fact that if he saw dishonesty as a game, he would never be someone I could trust. We ended things shortly after, and though it was a tough call, I knew it was the right one. Story 15. We were at a party one night with some of his friends. It was one of those casual get-togethers where everyone is hanging out and having fun. I was enjoying myself, chatting with some of the people there, when I noticed that he kept making passive-aggressive remarks about his friends' relationships. He would joke about how they were tied down, or how boring their lives must be because they were in serious relationships. It seemed harmless at first, but then it turned into a pattern. Every time one of his friends mentioned something about their significant other, he had something sarcastic or condescending to say. I started to feel a bit uncomfortable, but I didn't want to ruin the vibe of the party by bringing it up. As the night wore on, I realized how deeply critical he was of his friends, especially those who were in committed relationships. He would make fun of their commitment, calling them whipped, or acting like they had no freedom. It was as if he saw relationships as something to avoid, or worse, something to mock. I had to step away for a moment to gather my thoughts. When I returned, I realized how unattracted I was to his cynicism about relationships. He clearly didn't have a healthy view of love or commitment, and that was a huge red flag for me. It made me question whether he had any respect for the kind of bond I valued. We never hung out after that, and I couldn't bring myself to keep dating someone who saw relationships as a joke. Story 16. We had been dating for a few months when he suggested we spend the weekend with his family at their cabin. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to bond with them, so I was excited. The first night, we all gathered around the fire pit, having a good time. But as the night went on, things took a strange turn. His uncle started telling some off-color jokes that made everyone uncomfortable. And instead of defending anyone or saying anything, my boyfriend just laughed along. At first, I thought it was a one-time thing, but as the weekend continued, I realized that his entire family was like this. They made inappropriate comments about people's appearances, ridiculed others' lifestyles, and just generally acted with such disregard for respect. The worst part was how my boyfriend didn't seem to have a problem with it. He laughed at the jokes, participated in the conversations, and made no attempt to set boundaries. I couldn't believe that this was the man I was dating, the person who, just a few weeks ago, had seemed kind, respectful, and compassionate. But seeing him act this way in front of his family made me question everything. The attraction that I had once felt for him started to fade as I realized that he didn't have the courage to stand up for what was right, even in a small setting like that. By the end of the weekend, I knew I couldn't continue dating someone who didn't have the basic decency to challenge harmful behavior. It made me lose all respect. Story 17. We had been talking for a while and decided to go out to dinner together. Everything seemed fine at first. He was funny, charming, and we were both enjoying the conversation. As we sat down to eat, I mentioned that I had recently been working on a personal project, something I was really passionate about. I told him it was something I was building from the ground up, and I was excited about how it was coming together. But instead of showing interest or asking questions, he smirked and said, "Well, that's cute. But don't get your hopes up too much. It's probably going to fail, right?" He made it sound so dismissive, almost like he thought I was wasting my time. I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more hurt I felt. Here I was, sharing something I truly cared about, and he was making fun of it as if it didn't matter. When I tried to explain why it was important to me, he interrupted and said, "I mean, you're not going to be successful or anything. It's just a hobby." I wasn't sure if he was trying to be funny or if he genuinely didn't think it was worth anything. But that moment was when I realized that he didn't take me seriously. I needed someone who would support my ambitions and dreams, not someone who would belittle them. The attraction I had for him completely vanished, and I ended things soon after. Story 18. We were a few months into dating, and I thought we had a pretty healthy relationship. One afternoon, we went out for lunch at a quiet cafe, and as we were talking about our plans for the weekend, he casually mentioned that he had stalked one of my social media profiles. He laughed about it, as if it was no big deal. I was initially taken aback, but I tried to laugh along. But then he went on to describe things he had learned from my posts, personal details I hadn't even shared with him yet. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to react. He seemed proud of himself for doing it, as though it was perfectly normal. "I just wanted to know more about you," he said nonchalantly. But the way he said it, like it was some game, made my stomach churn. I had only shared those details with close friends, not someone I was casually dating. I told him that I didn't appreciate it and that it made me uncomfortable, but he just brushed it off, saying, "Oh, I was just being curious." His lack of respect for my privacy completely turned me off. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, and I couldn't trust someone who didn't understand boundaries. By the end of the lunch, I realized that this relationship wasn't going to work. I needed someone who respected my space, not someone who saw my personal life as something to dig into without permission. Story 19. We had been going out for a while, and things seemed to be going well. One night, we were watching a movie at his apartment when he made an offhand comment about women's bodies. At first, I thought he was just trying to make a joke, But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that it wasn't a joke at all. He started discussing how certain body types were ideal and how some women were just too big or too small. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about how he viewed women as objects to be judged based on their appearance. I felt myself getting more and more uncomfortable. I had always been confident in my own skin, but the way he was talking made me feel like I wasn't measuring up to some arbitrary standard. What bothered me even more was that he was so matter-of-fact about it. He didn't even seem to realize how hurtful his words were. When I tried to challenge him, asking him why he thought it was okay to talk like that, he shrugged and said, "It's just the way it is. I'm not the only one who thinks this way." That's when I realized that his perception of women and relationships was entirely superficial. I couldn't be with someone who saw women's worth only through the lens of how they looked. The attraction I had for him dissolved completely, and I ended the relationship the next day. I needed someone who valued me for more than just my appearance. Story 20. I had been casually dating this guy for a few weeks, and he invited me to meet up for drinks after work one day. We went to a trendy bar in the city, and I was looking forward to having some one-on-one time. The conversation was fine at first, but then he started talking about his career, and I could tell that he had a lot of pride in it. As he spoke, it quickly became clear that he was boasting about every single thing he had achieved. He would interrupt me mid-sentence to tell me another story about how he nailed a project or outperformed everyone else at work. It wasn't just confidence, it was arrogance. He constantly compared himself to others, belittling anyone he saw as below him. I started to feel like he wasn't even interested in getting to know me. He just wanted to talk about how amazing he was. When I mentioned something I had accomplished at work, he barely acknowledged it and quickly redirected the conversation back to his achievements. I could tell he didn't see me as an equal. I didn't need someone who was obsessed with their own success and couldn't acknowledge the value of others. As the night went on, I felt more and more distant. By the end of the evening, I realized that I was no longer attracted to him. It wasn't just his constant self-promotion. It was his inability to share the spotlight, to make space for anyone else's accomplishments or interests. I knew then that I wasn't going to continue seeing him. Story 21. We had been dating for a few months, and we were starting to talk about the possibility of moving in together. One evening, we went out to dinner to discuss the future. I was excited to talk about it because I felt we were on the same page. I shared my hopes for a place that we could both make our own, one where we could grow together. I wanted to talk about our plans in a way that was collaborative, but as we discussed it, I realized he wasn't as interested in compromise as I had thought. He started describing how his ideal living situation was, and it quickly became clear that he had a very rigid idea of what he wanted. Things like where the furniture should go, what color the walls should be, and even the type of art he wanted hanging. Every time I made a suggestion, he'd dismiss it without a second thought. He even said, "Well, I don't really care about your opinion because this is what I like, and I'll be the one paying the bills anyway." I tried to explain that it was important for me to feel like my voice mattered, but he just shrugged it off. The more I tried to explain how I was feeling, the more he became irritated, as if my thoughts were a nuisance. That moment made me realize that he wasn't someone who could share in decisions or build a partnership. Instead, he wanted control. His attitude made me lose all attraction. I couldn't imagine living in a place where my thoughts and desires weren't valued, and I ended things shortly after that dinner. Story 22. I had been seeing this guy for a while, and while we had our differences, I really liked him. We'd been hanging out in a group of friends, and one night, we all went out to a bar to have some fun. It was an open space with a lively crowd, and I felt pretty comfortable. At one point, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, I noticed him talking to another woman. He seemed to be flirting with her, laughing and touching her arm lightly. I tried to brush it off, but the more I observed, the more it became clear that he was paying her a lot of attention. He was leaning in too closely, making personal comments, and ignoring the fact that I was standing right there. When I walked up to him, he gave me a quick, distracted smile and continued the conversation, completely disregarding my presence. I didn't want to make a scene, so I stood there awkwardly for a few minutes, hoping he would notice. Eventually, I decided to leave. I didn't even say goodbye to him. I just left the bar and went home. When he called me later that night, he acted completely surprised that I was upset. He said, "It was just harmless flirting, nothing serious." But I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't respect me enough to notice how hurtful his actions were. His casual attitude about it made me realize that he wasn't serious about us. The attraction was gone. I didn't want to be with someone who would treat me like an afterthought when someone else caught their attention. I didn't return his calls after that. Story 23. We'd been dating for a while, and I was starting to feel really comfortable with him. He was thoughtful, caring, and I felt like we were building something strong. One day, we were hanging out at his apartment just watching TV and having some snacks. Out of nowhere, he turned to me and said, "I think it's cute that you try to be independent, but honestly, I don't think women can handle things on their own. You need someone to take care of you." I was taken aback, and at first I laughed it off, thinking maybe he was joking. But he continued, "You think you can do everything, but you need a guy to make sure you're doing things right. You should let me help you more, especially when it comes to things like finances or decision-making." My heart sank. I had always prided myself on being self-sufficient, and I didn't need anyone to take care of me. I told him that I valued independence and that I didn't need him to make decisions for me. He gave me this patronizing smile and said, "That's cute, but you'll see. One day you'll understand that a man knows better." I was completely disgusted. That moment shattered my perception of him. His assumption that I needed his control in order to thrive made me feel small and worthless. No matter how much I had liked him before, the attraction disappeared when I realized how little he valued my independence. I ended things soon after that conversation, realizing that no amount of charm could make up for such a condescending attitude. Story 24. I had been in a casual relationship with this guy for a few months, and while I wasn't expecting anything too serious, I was enjoying the time we spent together. One night, we were out with some friends at a local pub. We were all having a good time, laughing, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. But as the night went on, I started noticing something disturbing. Every time someone mentioned a woman in the group, whether it was talking about a mutual friend or commenting on someone walking by, he would make these incredibly crude, objectifying comments. He'd call women derogatory names, rate their bodies like they were pieces of meat, and laugh about it. At first, I tried to brush it off, but the more he did it, the more disgusted I felt. I couldn't believe that someone I had been seeing could have such a lack of respect for women. I tried to redirect the conversation, but every time I did, he'd just turn it back to more crude remarks. When I mentioned that it made me uncomfortable, he laughed and said, "You're just too sensitive. It's not that big of a deal." That was the moment I knew I couldn't continue seeing him. His blatant disrespect for women made me lose all attraction, and I wasn't going to stay in a situation where I felt like I had to constantly defend my values. I walked out of the bar and never contacted him again. Story 25. We had been on a few dates, and I was starting to feel like we were really hitting it off. One evening, he invited me over to his place to watch a movie and relax. I was looking forward to it because I thought it would be a nice, low-key evening. We ordered pizza, got comfortable on the couch, and began the movie. About halfway through, I realized that he wasn't paying any attention to the movie at all. Instead, he was glued to his phone, scrolling through social media. Every few minutes, he would make a comment about a post he saw, laugh, or show me a meme. I tried to engage with him about the movie, but he would barely respond, his attention always drifting back to his phone. I felt invisible, as though he was more interested in his virtual life than in spending time with me. I waited for him to put his phone down, hoping it was just a passing thing, but it didn't happen. Finally, I asked him, "Hey, are you even watching the movie?" He looked up at me like I was the one being unreasonable and said, "Relax. It's not a big deal. We're just hanging out." That was the moment I lost all attraction. If he couldn't give me his full attention for one evening, then what was the point? I felt like I was competing with his phone, and I wasn't interested in being second place. I told him I was heading home and never saw him again after that night. Story 26. We had been seeing each other casually for a while, and one night we decided to go to a concert together. I was excited because I'd heard a lot about the band, and I knew it would be a fun experience. When we arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Everyone was excited, and we found our spots near the stage. Everything seemed perfect. Until about halfway through the show, he suddenly started getting really annoyed with the crowd around us. He complained about people being too loud and ruining the vibe by dancing. At first, I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day, but his frustration only grew as the night went on. He started pushing past people in an attempt to get closer to the stage, not caring about the people he was shoving aside. When I asked him to calm down and enjoy the music, he snapped at me, saying, "You just don't get it. These people are ruining the experience, and I can't stand it." The concert went from being something I was excited about to an uncomfortable ordeal. I found myself trying to make excuses for his behavior, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't respectful of anyone around him, including me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that someone who couldn't enjoy a shared experience without getting angry at other people wasn't someone I could see myself with. By the end of the night, I felt completely turned off, and I knew that this was the last time we'd hang out. The following week, I ended things. He wasn't the type of person I wanted to be around. Story 27. We had been dating for a few months, and one weekend, we decided to go on a road trip together. We both loved the idea of exploring a new place, but I didn't realize how differently we would handle the trip. From the beginning, he took control of every aspect of the plan. He dictated where we would stop, what we would do, and even what we would eat. I didn't mind taking a back seat at first, thinking it was just his way of being organized. But when I suggested stopping at a place I wanted to check out, he brushed it off as not worth it. The entire trip, he made no effort to consider my interests. Every time I mentioned something I wanted to do or see, he would scoff, saying, "We're not here for that. This is what we're doing." End of story. It was as if my opinions didn't matter at all. As the weekend went on, I started feeling more like a passenger in my own life than a partner. It became clear that he wasn't interested in compromise. Everything had to be on his turn. The final straw came when I asked if we could take a scenic route back, and he flat out refused, saying, "I don't have time for detours." I spent the rest of the trip feeling disrespected and trapped in a situation I had no control over. By the time we got home, I knew I couldn't keep dating someone who didn't value my input. I ended things soon after, realizing that I wanted someone who would want to share experiences, not dictate them. Story 28. We were at a bar with some of his friends and everything seemed like a normal night out. We were chatting, laughing, and enjoying the atmosphere. But as the night wore on, I noticed something unsettling. Every time we would get into a conversation with one of his friends, he would start undermining. He'd dismiss my opinions with little sarcastic remarks or act like he knew better. For example, when I mentioned a book I had been reading, he interrupted and said, "Oh, that sounds like something a teenage girl would read." He then proceeded to talk over me, acting as though my interest in literature didn't matter. His friends seemed to notice, but no one said anything. I tried to laugh it off, but it started to sting. I began to feel invisible, like I wasn't even being heard. The more he spoke over me, the more uncomfortable I became. I realized that he had no respect for what I had to say. He thought his opinions were more important than mine, and that wasn't something I could tolerate. At the end of the night, I told him I was going home. When I got back to my place, I reflected on the evening and realized that I had lost all respect for him. I wasn't interested in someone who didn't value me, and I ended things shortly after. I needed a partner who would listen, not belittle me. Story 29. I had been seeing this guy for a few months and things seemed to be progressing well. We had been on a few casual dates, and we were starting to spend more time together. One afternoon, we decided to grab lunch and take a walk through a park. The weather was perfect, and we were having a great time chatting about random things. But then, out of nowhere, he started making comments about how women should act in relationships. He said, "I'm just telling you, women are supposed to be supportive and never question their man. That's how it works if you want things to last." I was shocked, and at first I thought he was joking. But he continued, "I don't want someone who challenges me or gives me attitude. That's not the kind of relationship I want." He even mentioned that he thought it was cute when women were submissive and agreed with everything their partner said. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just his opinions, it was the way he thought relationships should work. He seemed to think that the only role a woman had was to be agreeable and supportive, in a way that meant sacrificing her own thoughts and desires. I didn't know what to say at first, but I knew in that moment that I couldn't be with someone who viewed women as second to their own needs. I excused myself and went home, and the next day, I ended things with him. I didn't want a relationship where I was expected to play a role that was so limiting. Story 30. We were hanging out at his apartment one evening, just enjoying a movie and some takeout. I thought it would be a low-key fun night, but it quickly turned uncomfortable. At some point during the movie, he started commenting on how women in films always looked too fake or too thin. I didn't think much of it at first, but then he made an offhand remark about how he could never date someone who was bigger than a size 4. I tried to laugh it off, but he seemed to genuinely believe that any woman who wasn't skinny enough wasn't worth his time. His words stung more than I expected. I tried to steer the conversation to something lighter, but he continued making comments about body image, as if it was normal to judge people based on their size. "It's just the way it is," he said, shrugging when I mentioned how hurtful his comments were. That was the moment I realized that I couldn't date someone who was so superficial and judgmental about women's bodies. I wasn't just offended for myself. I was upset that someone would think that way about others, too. I left his apartment that night and never returned his calls. The attraction I had felt for him evaporated completely, and I knew that I deserved better than someone who couldn't see beyond appearances. Story 31. I had been seeing him for a few weeks and everything seemed to be going well. We shared similar interests and had a lot of fun together. One night, we decided to meet up for dinner at a cozy little Italian restaurant in town. It was one of those places that made you feel instantly comfortable, and I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to talk more about where things were headed. However, as the night went on, I started noticing how much he talked about himself. At first, it wasn't a big deal. He was sharing some personal anecdotes and I was listening. But the more we talked, the more he seemed to steer every conversation back to. If I tried to share a story or express an opinion, he quickly interrupted with something about his own life. The final straw came when I told him I had just started a new hobby, something I was excited about. Instead of asking me questions or showing any interest, he responded with, "I don't really get how people waste time on stuff like that. But sure, if it makes you happy." It wasn't just that he didn't care. It was the dismissive way he said it, as if my passion didn't matter. I sat there in disbelief, realizing how one-sided the conversation had been. The attraction I had for him disappeared that night. Someone who couldn't take an interest in my life, or even show basic consideration for my feelings, wasn't someone I could be with. I ended things the following day, knowing I deserved someone who could appreciate me, not just himself. Story 32. We had been in a relationship for several months, and things had been progressing smoothly. We spent weekends together, traveled occasionally, and I thought we had a good connection. One evening, he invited me over to his apartment to hang out. We were both in a chill mood, just watching some TV, when his phone rang. He answered it casually, but his tone shifted immediately. It was his ex-girlfriend. As he talked to her, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation. He was being overly friendly, laughing at things she said, and it seemed like they were having a private joke between. What struck me was the lack of boundaries. I had known they were still in touch, but hearing him talk to her like this while I was right there made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. I didn't want to make a scene, so I stayed quiet, but inside I was fuming. When he hung up, I tried to bring it up calmly, saying that I felt awkward about how close he seemed to still be with his ex. He brushed it off, saying, "You're just being paranoid. She's an old friend, and we're fine." But it wasn't about being paranoid. It was about respect. I couldn't be with someone who had such blurred lines when it came to their past relationships. The attraction I had for him slowly faded after that night. I knew deep down that if he couldn't understand why I felt uncomfortable, we were never going to work. A few days later, I ended things, realizing that I deserved someone who could create clear boundaries and prioritize our relationship. Story 33. We had been dating for a few months, and things had been moving along pretty smoothly. We spent a lot of time together, doing everything from watching movies to hiking, and I felt like we had a good rhythm. One afternoon, we went to a local coffee shop to grab some drinks. The place was a little busy and we had to wait in line. As we waited, I noticed him staring at the barista who was taking orders. She was a few years younger than us and had a warm smile. I didn't think much of it until I noticed that he was still staring at her, even after he had placed our order. I laughed and nudged him, thinking he was just being a little silly, but he didn't seem to notice. Instead, he continued to watch her. I could feel myself getting uncomfortable, and when the barista handed us our drinks, he made an offhand comment. "She's cute. Maybe I'll ask her out next time." I was stunned. At first, I didn't know how to respond, but I quickly realized how disrespectful his comment was. I felt completely invisible in that moment, like I wasn't even standing right next to him. I didn't say anything at first, but as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't value me the way he should. That night, I tried to talk to him about it, and he just laughed it off, saying, "I was just kidding, don't be so sensitive." But it wasn't about being sensitive, it was about basic respect. I knew that if he couldn't understand why that comment bothered, the attraction I had for him would be gone. I ended things the next day, realizing that I couldn't be with someone who didn't value my presence or treat me with the respect I deserved. Story 34. We had been dating for a while, and I thought we were on the same page. We had similar interests, enjoyed spending time together, and I felt like we had a lot in common. However, one evening, we were at a friend's party, and something happened that made me rethink everything. We were standing in a circle with some of his friends, talking and laughing. I casually mentioned that I had recently started a new fitness routine, something I was really proud of. He immediately made a dismissive comment saying, "Well, I don't know why you bother with that. You don't need to lose weight or anything." His tone was casual, but it felt like a jab. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just an awkward comment, but then he continued saying, "But if you really want to get serious about it, you should definitely work on your abs." I felt my face flush. I had never discussed my body in detail with him before, and hearing him talk about it like that was jarring. He didn't seem to notice how uncomfortable I was, and his friends didn't help either, just standing there awkwardly. I realized at that moment that I didn't feel respected by him. I didn't need someone to tell me how to look or what I should change about myself. The rest of the night felt off, and by the time we got home, I knew that I couldn't be with someone who didn't understand how to show support without making me feel inadequate. I ended things shortly after that conversation. Story 35. We had been seeing each other casually for a few weeks, and one night, we decided to go out for dinner and drinks with a few of his friends. It was supposed to be a fun, laid-back evening, but something happened that made me completely lose interest in him. As the night went on, he started getting more and more drunk, and I noticed that he was getting louder and more obnoxious. He started making jokes at other people's expense, laughing at their clothing choices, their accents, and even their weight. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause a scene, so I tried to brush it off. But then he started making comments about women in general, saying things like, I don't understand why women get so worked up over their looks. I mean, who cares? I tried to change the subject, but it only got worse. He started commenting on random women passing by, calling them names and rating their attractiveness like they were objects. The more he spoke, the more disgusted I felt. I couldn't believe that someone I was dating could talk like that, especially after just a few weeks. I realized then that he didn't have the respect or maturity I was looking for in a partner. I told him I was going home early and walked out. The next day, I texted him to end things. His lack of consideration and the way he treated others had completely turned me off, and I knew I couldn't be with someone who didn't understand basic decency.